Hi, I'm Marlo from Wild Food UK, and today I'm doing a video that I should have done a long time ago. I'm going to go through the rules that we teach in the UK with regards to foraging. These are the rules that we teach and that we follow. And if you guys follow these rules too, then you will be foraging safely, you'll be foraging sustainably, you'll be foraging respectfully, and you will be foraging within the law. So those rules are different. They're different depending on what kind of land you're on in the UK, but there's a couple of rules that apply wherever you are, full stop. And the first one's really simple, and that's that if you know something's rare or protected, then wherever you are, you just shouldn't pick it. There's something called Schedule 8, which you can find on the Natural England website, which is a list of all of the protected species that we have of plants, lichens, mosses and fungi throughout the UK. It's a very long list, so I'm not going to be able to run through it right now. There's not enough mushrooms on it, in my opinion, but it's worth having a look at that list. If there's a plant you can't recognise, it might be one of those. So take photos, don't pick. The second thing is that the rules I teach and what I teach about only really applies to the UK. So in different countries, clearly you've got different foraging rules and codes. And also you have different species of mushrooms and plants that we don't have in the UK. So for example, I've done a few videos on the parasol mushroom, which in the UK doesn't really have any truly dangerous lookalikes. But in the United States, for example, there is a lookalike for our parasol. It's called the green spored parasol, which is more toxic than any of the lookalikes we have in the UK. It's called, I think colloquially, the vomiter. So you can tell by the name, it's not one that you want to eat. Where I am right now is my back garden, and so I'm going to start by telling you about the rules on private property, because they are by far the most simple. If you're on private property, then all you need to do is get the landowner's permission to forage. But like I said, leave anything that you find that's rare or protected behind, full stop, even when you're on private property. And incidentally, private property is the only place that you can legally forage commercially in the UK. Commercial foraging is something I'm going to come back to at the end of this little video, but for now we're going to go and explore some other types of land. So now I'm in one of my favourite places to come foraging. As you can see around me, there's loads of oak trees, plenty of mature beech and loads of moss. So this is one of my favourite places to come picking mushrooms. And this is what's classed as public access land or common land. There's no signs designating this as something else, and I didn't have to jump over any fences to get in here. Now, most of the time when you're out foraging, you're going to be on that public access land. That's your local hedgerows and verges and parks and places that, like I say, aren't otherwise designated by a sign or fenced in. And the rules for foraging on public access land, therefore, they're the most important ones to know. They come mainly from the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, but we add in a few of our own rules because we don't think the Countryside Act goes far enough. What the Countryside Act talks about when it talks about foraging is the 4 F's, because that's what we're after as foragers. That's the fruit, the flowers, the foliage and the fungus, or the fruit, the flowers, the leaves and the mushrooms. And what the Countryside Act says is that as long as you're not picking from anything rare on Schedule 8, then you can take what you want to from the 4 F's, but for personal consumption only. That rules out commercial foraging. Also, the Countryside Act says that you're not supposed to uproot any plants from common land, full stop. So that means that if you're out in a woodland like this, you can't go digging up your pignut or your woodavens. That's the rules. We add in some extra rules of our own though. So first of all, we say never pick more than half of what you find of anything from anywhere. And if you find a small patch of something, leave it all behind, full stop. Only pick from places that are abundant. Now that rule applies most importantly to the annual species of plant, not the mushrooms, because the mushrooms are just a fruiting body of an organism that might live longer than you. And obviously if you're picking damsons from a damson tree, you know that tree is probably still going to be there next year. But every annual species of plant has to be able to go to flower and to seed each year to survive. Now, with regards to 3 of the F's, that's what we do, the fruit, the flowers and the foliage. But with regards to the mushrooms, the fungus, we've got our own picking limit. And that limit is 1.5 kilos of mushrooms whenever you go out foraging, which to me is enough for personal consumption. That's a reasonable size basket full of mushrooms. That is a rule. It's not a rule rather, but that's a guideline that I will break in certain circumstances. So for example, I've regularly found a group of giant puffballs where every single one of them is over 1.5 kilos, and what I don't want you to do is start shaving bits off the mushroom to get it down to 1.5 kilos. Just take one of the giant puffballs home to make your giant puffball schnitzels. And also in spring, I've been in plenty of parks where a lawnmower's been heading towards 3 or 4 kilos of St. George's mushrooms. And at that point, I'll get my wife to lie down in front of the mower and I'll pick all those mushrooms because they're about to get destroyed. So apply common sense to that rule. But in general, one basket full, about 1.5 kilos of mushrooms is what we consider to be a reasonable amount of mushrooms for personal consumption. Those are the rules for foraging on common land, and also apply those to the byways and bridleways that I'm about to tell you about. So now on to farmland and the rules we follow on farmland. Now you might be surprised to know that roughly 72% of Britain is actually farmland, but most of it has byways or bridleways across it, which are always or should always be designated by a sign like this. And as you can see, this leads us straight into some farmland that way. Now, as long as you're on those byways and bridleways, then you are allowed to pick, but only from wild species of plants and mushrooms. If you stray off of those byways and bridleways, you're actually trespassing. And some of the farmers around here are about 7 feet tall and they've all got guns and dogs, so they're not the sort of people you want to annoy. So stick to those byways and bridleways. And obviously, if you're picking things like carrots and cabbages and sweet corn, that is not called foraging. That's called theft, which is against the law. Now, I'm lucky enough to live in Herefordshire, where there is lots of lovely green space and lots of farmland. When I moved here, my house is surrounded by orchards and fields. So the first thing I did was find out who owned them. I went and knocked on their door and said, "Hello, I'm a forager. Do you mind me walking around the edges of your fields, picking your weeds?" And funnily enough, that farmer did not have a problem with that at all, but guaranteed if he'd caught me in the wrong part of his farm, he would have been annoyed and he would have had every right to be. And like I've said, they're not the sort of people that you want to annoy. But they are the sort of people that you want to talk to. They've got the inside information. They know where the sloe bushes are, where the blackthorn or the damsons or the crab apples have grown in years gone by. And they also know which fields they've left fallow for years and years, because those are the fields that you're likely to find your things like field mushrooms and giant puffballs and parasols in. So they can point you in the right direction. It's also good to talk to farmers for one other reason, and that's because they do spray nasties at certain times of year, things like pesticides and fungicides and neonicotinoids, things that you as a forager do not want to ingest. So I stay friendly with my local farmers and they let me know when they're spraying, and I don't go foraging in those fields for a good few weeks afterwards at least. those are the rules for farmland. Make sure you don't annoy your farmers, and they're a great source of information. So this is a bit of an innocuous looking field behind me, but as I said earlier in this video, look out for the signs. And some signs you'll see will say that places are a nature reserve, some will say that the place is managed by one organisation or another, and if they are managed properties that you're on, then ask permission from whoever manages that property before you start foraging. But in particular, look out for signs like this one. This place is called the Flits, and the Flits is a remnant of a traditional Herefordshire landscape of spring-fed flowery meadows, pastures, marshes, ditches and wet woodland flanking a small stream. Birds, mammals, dragonflies and butterflies abound, but the reserve is of national importance for its rare soldier flies, snail flies and crane flies, insects of wet and damp places. And down here we've got a logo. That is the logo of Natural England, and if you see that logo, then there's a good chance that the site that you're on is managed by Natural England for a start, but it might have a special preservation order on it, it might have a special conservation order on it, or it might be like this one. If we come and have a look at the back, I'll let you get in there, Ben. Might want to get round a bit further. There you are. It might be a SSSI site, a site of special scientific interest. This National Nature Reserve has been notified as a site of special scientific interest under Section 28 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It is an offence without reasonable excuse, intentionally or recklessly to destroy or damage any of the flora, fauna or geological or physiological features by reason of which the land is of special interest. So we go back round to the front. We've already found out that this site is of national importance for some flies, soldier flies, snail flies and crane flies. Now that might not sound like much, but they are designated as being of national importance. Now I don't know personally what soldier flies, snail flies or even crane flies, daddy longlegses. I don't know what they eat. So I don't know if what I'm picking from this site is in the overall food chain that those important insects rely on. Which means that because I don't understand this site enough, I will not forage from it. Now, not everywhere that's designated SSSI is because of flies. Some are because of rare orchids or rare butterflies or even rare fungus. Some are SSSI for geological reasons though, and I do know one up in Cheshire that's a SSSI site because it's where Darwin found some of his fossils that helped him form his theory of evolution. Now, when I went foraging there with Natural England, clearly I wasn't going to damage the fossils that Darwin had found many years before and that had been there for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. So if you truly understand a SSSI site, why it's a SSSI site and what is in the food chain of the reason that it's a SSSI site, then some of them are okay for foraging in. And we do have permission to run courses in a couple of SSSI sites around the country. But until you understand why a place has a special conservation, a special preservation, or a SSSI site order on it, just don't forage there. There's plenty of other places around here to pick your wild mushrooms and your wildflowers. So those are the rules that we teach with regards to foraging in the UK. They're also the rules that I follow, and I believe that if you follow those rules, you are foraging correctly. I just want to add a couple more bits of information for you guys though. There's been a debate raging forever, and it will probably rage forevermore, over whether you should cut mushrooms or pick them out the ground. That's based on, if you're picking them out the ground, you might be damaging the mycelium of the mushroom, or if you cut them, you might be leaving an open wound for infection. It really makes no difference either way, and if you don't know what a mushroom is, you have to get to the base of that mushroom stem, because quite often key identifying features are at the base of a mushroom stem. One thing I do want to say though is that at the moment we don't have to forage. We'll see what happens with Putins and pandemics in the next few years, but at the moment we can still go to the shops. And to me that means that if somewhere's a little bit special to you, then just don't forage there. Leave it as natural as you can. You know, we need to look after our natural environment in the UK. So if you think somewhere's a bit special for whatever reason and you don't want it spoilt in any way, then just don't forage there. Lastly, I'm going to come back onto the commercial foraging thing, because it did start to cause a bit of a problem, mainly around London in the UK back in the noughties. I blame this Danish restaurant called Noma and the genius chef that used to run it called Rennie Recep. Now, all that he used to serve was foraged food, and he won so many awards that made foraged food trendy all of a sudden. And then all of the London restaurant industry decided to start putting foraged ingredients onto their menus so that they could get on trend. Now, off of the back of that, a sort of illicit foraging trade sprang up around London, where people were going out into the woods, parks, fields and forests and just picking everything that they could find to then go on and sell to suppliers and to restaurants. And there were people caught leaving places like Epping Forest with upwards of 60 kilos of mushrooms at a time, and bootloads of wild garlic and things like that. Now that is doing ecological damage, and when you consider that a third of the whole population of Britain lives in and around London, in London and those home counties, those green spaces like Epping Forest are already under a little bit of pressure just purely because of footfall. So around London in particular, they've brought in what are called local bylaws. A local bylaw is just a law that applies to a space or a place or a green or a borough perhaps. And lots of the famous and royal parks around London have brought in local bylaws which outlaw foraging entirely. So Hyde Park, Regent Park, Richmond Park, Wimbledon Common, Epping Forest for example. All of those places have bylaws now that mean that if you pick a mushroom, you are potentially going to get fined something like £250, and that means that obviously you shouldn't do it at all. To find out those local bylaws, this really only applies if you live in and around London. Then whenever you go to any park, like I said earlier in this video, look at the signs. Normally at the entrance of every park like Richmond Park, there's a big brown sign with a map on the front saying you are here and telling you a few of the interesting things about the park. Quite often on the back of those you'll find a printed list of all of the local bylaws that apply to that place, and they're worth a read because they'll tell you some interesting things from antiquity. You might see no racing horse and carts after midnight, or no driving geese across the bridge before March, or I think in certain parts of Britain you can still shoot a Welshman if you're facing west with a bow and arrow at noon. So it's worth reading them because you might see some interesting information there, but you might also see on those lists that the removal of plants or mushrooms from the park is not permitted, and if you see that, then just don't do it. There are still plenty of places to go foraging in and around London, but do it respectfully and make sure you find out if there are any local bylaws that apply. Commercial foraging, incidentally, is only legal in the UK if you're on private property and you have the landowner's permission to do so. I hope this video has made sense to you all, and I hope those rules have been nice and clear. Thank you for listening, and happy foraging.